Hi, I'm Art Colts, host of Around Town with Cable Channel 40. At Around Town, we discover the unique features of our beautiful Upper Kittitas County community and share them with you. Today we're in Roslyn at the Roslyn Museum. We're going to go find Nick Henderson, who is the president of the museum, and find out what happened in Roslyn 100 years ago. Having a good day?
Very good day.
Nick, the museum is kind of like a time machine here, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Can you tell us a little bit about how it came into existence?
The museum was built in 1969 and opened in 1970 by the Roslyn Historical Museum Society, which had been incorporated in 1961. When the mines started to close down, the people realized they needed to start saving some of their history. And so it was the first 8 years of existence was taken up in fundraising to build this building and get the land donated that the building sits on. And then we've been open ever since 1971, and we stay open with donations from the public. And we've been very proud to say we've never had to have our hand out for a government grant.
So from the very beginning, it's been a community effort to fund it, to staff it, and actually to fill it with these great time items.
Yes, the community has been very generous with the museum and very generous with items from their family histories and items from the coal mining era of Roslyn and the lodges and many, many items.
Nick, we're excited about taking a time tour through Roslyn. Can you help us?
Let's do it.
Nick, the town of Roslyn had people in it. This, in many instances, is their story. Looks like we're starting here with the mail.
We'll start here. This was the post office in Roslyn, the main postmaster's window in here when the town was first formed. And when they remodeled the post office, we were able to obtain this from the post office. And we have some actual old Roslyn canceling stamps here. This one showed that the mail was canceled on March 25th at 11 a.m. in 1915, when they hand canceled everything at the store. Another item that we have here, Roslyn was a coal mining town that had a company store, and the old song of "I owe my soul to the company store" was very true. And the company store had the cashiers in the back end of the store, and at the front where you would purchase your shoes or your groceries, whatever department, they had this instrument called the Lamsom system. And what it did was the clerk would put your money in this cup, put it up here, clip the receipt here, and then shoot it back to the cashier like that. And the cashier would make your change.
It went a long way.
And shoot it back to you. And that way the cashiers were separate from the general public of the store.
Nick, we were talking about the people. Obviously, the people served this community as well.
The largest majority of Roslyn residents were foreign immigrants that understood the greatness of America and how free they were when they came from Europe under the different feudal systems they lived, and they were very proud to serve their country. And this display case here demonstrates some of the items that have been donated from the servicemen of Roslyn, from World War I uniform up to some jungle boots that were used in the Vietnam era, World War I helmets and Bavarian helmets, some World War II, these little flashlight looking things were actually used in World War II, and those were run off a D battery, and if you went overboard, you clipped that to your life vest, and that little light would be bright enough out in the dark ocean so they could pick you up at night. We also have two very good scrapbooks from Roslyn residents that served in the Aleutians during World War II, that one of the local veterans, his sister, kept all the newspaper articles of the Aleutian campaign, and we've got great articles on here when they were on Attu and Adak and the different islands in the Aleutians, and I don't think a lot of people realize that they actually landed on U.S. soil besides the Hawaiian Islands. And even the miners, this was hung in the office of the Roslyn Cascade Coal Company, known locally as Patrick's, and these are the gentlemen that worked for the mine that served World War II. And the Patrick Mine Company proudly displayed that in their office as their roll of honor.
The ultimate sacrifice.
Yes, and there were some of our local boys that did the ultimate sacrifice. This photo here with the gold frame is Herbert Irwin, the first soldier from Roslyn. He was a Marine in World War I that perished in World War I, but we also had some greatness rise through the military ranks. This is General John Harold Sides accepting his flag from the admiral after he retired as chief of the Pacific Fleet. He was commander-in-chief of SINCPAC and was raised in Roslyn. His family had a butcher shop in the building that's now occupied by the Roslyn Cafe. And Admiral Sides is credited with as the father of the guided missile Navy and has a naval guided missile frigate named in his honor.
All from Roslyn.
All from Roslyn, just from our little Roslyn. Besides defending the country, Roslyn was also big on recreation. And if we turn to this wall, Roslyn enjoyed a great sports history, and at one time Roslyn had what would be considered today a minor league team in the Pacific Coast League. And you can see on these photos up here of the grandstand we had at the baseball park, which is now Runge Field, and some of the baseball players, and we had a Moose Lodge here where their team was the champions in the early part of the century. We had a YMCA in town. We had a lot of community involvement. In fact, in this photo, earlier when I was mentioning John Sides, the admiral that was in charge of the Pacific Fleet, this is his father that was the butcher in town, and he played for the Roslyn Grays. That was their baseball team in 1904. So we've had a very big history of sports in this town and very athletic team, and the grandstand would be full of people every weekend coming out to enjoy a baseball game.
Where was the grandstand?
The grandstand would be in the north corner of the Runge Field where the baseball diamond is now. It was a huge wooden structure that was torn down in the late 60s. The city was worried about liability and disrepair of the building, but it would probably seat 200 to 300 people in the covered grandstand. It was quite a ballpark.
So they played sports. Looks like there was also some cultural entertainment that went on here.
There was a lot of that. Roslyn had a lot of fine musicians, and these are some of the uniform caps that the city bands would have. Some violins. This one on the lower shelf is well over 100 years old. That was brought from England by the Bromley family. And there was a lot of music in the households. There was music in the dance halls in town. We had the Three GIs, which was a band made up of Swede Swanson, Joe Meritich, and Ed Violetta. We had the Music Makers, which was Ernie Bresnikar's band, probably the best known of all the bands around here. And some of Ernie's musicians went on to teach at Central Washington University. Bob Beep Panario was a professor of music down there, and John Mowd was a professor of jazz studies at the university, and they'd both played for the Ernie Bresnikar band in its heyday of swing music and dance hall bands. It was as much as they worked, they played. This large map blueprint is the entire coal field that was mined out in the Clallam-Roslyn area. That represents about 6 miles long and about 3 miles wide, with the locations of the mine entries and the dates the mines were in operation. And those depict all the tunnels and different levels that are under Clallam-Roslyn and Ronald.
Good grief. This is a honeycomb.
It's a honeycomb. And also I have people that look at that map and said they want to know what city it is. And I said it's the city of the subterranean, because if you look closely at it, you could actually make out what would be your main boulevards and your streets and avenues and alleys. So it's very much like a city, but it's all underground.
That's an amazing document.
It represents about 65 million tons of coal that was mined out of the area, which was only 1/5 of the coal deposit that's here.
Well, Nick, people lived here. They were entertained here. They were educated here. Looks like they worked here too.
They worked here too. When they went down in those subterranean tunnels shown on that mine map, the first thing they would do is check in at the fire boss office or the mine boss's office, and they would take one of these tabs. And these are miner's checks. That was fastened to your belt, and that was a way of letting people know who was in and out of the mine. So at the first of the shift, you'd pick that up and then ride down into the mine, and then at the end of your shift, you'd hang it back up, and everybody had their own number assigned to them. You also would pick up your hard hat and your battery pack, which is here, and wear that all day on your belt. That's what gave you the light down inside the mine. We have some other mining instruments in here. These little wind gauges were used. They had air forced into the mines by squirrel cage fans to breathe fresh air for the miners. And these were used to measure the velocity of the wind so that it would know to turn the fans up, turn them down, what they were doing. All the miners also carried first aid packs, these little olive green colored tin cans, look like a sardine can, were sealed first aid packs down inside the mine, and they were all required to take first aid training, which they all carried a card, took the first aid training, and this bucket behind was their lunch bucket. You ate your lunch down. Once you went down inside the mine, you were down there all day. And the top half of the lunch bucket was for your sandwich and fruit, whatever you'd pack for lunch, and the bottom half is where you packed your drinking water for the day.
I take that that's a equivalent of a flashlight?
This is one of the early mine lamps before they got carbide and electric mine lamps. This was fired with coal oil, and then that wick was burned, so it was basically kind of like a candle on the front of your hat. And that was that, and then the reflector plate gave off a little more light.
I see here we have some steel-toed shoes.
These were brought over by the Cusworth family from England, and they were used in these mines. They're hobnailed on the bottom to keep you from slipping on the rocks inside the mines, and also to keep the wear of the rocks and the oil from the coal wearing on your leather a little longer. The cylinder light behind it is a Davy or a safety lamp that we used by the fire boss to go into the mine before the shift started to check for methane gas and for carbon dioxide. There was a little flame inside there. These lamps were fueled with alcohol, and so the methane being lighter than air, the fire boss would hold it up high to check for methane. If the flame started to grow inside that light, he knew he was getting into methane, and he could mark it on the timber. And then carbon dioxide being heavier, or the miners here called it black damp, he would hang it down low by the floor of the mine, and if the flame started to shrink, that told him there was bad air there, and that's how they would direct the mine air with canvas curtains called bradishes. So it was kind of like a duct system in your furnace, directing the air to where they needed to flush that air out. The methane was explosive, and the black damp would suffocate you.
This work sounded a little dangerous.
It was a little dangerous. Besides worrying about if you're going to get it trapped in an explosion or suffocate from that, there was also the danger of a cave-in. There was the danger of a trip, which is the little train of coal cars coming by and being hit by a trip. And then in the later years, when they replaced mules in the mines with the electric locomotives that would take the mine cars in and out the side entries, you had direct current wires above your head that powered those, so you could also get electrocuted in the mines.
A little dangerous.
Just about everything down there could kill you some way or another, so you better keep your wits about you. One of the most dangerous jobs in the mine was the rope rider. And he would ride between the second and third coal car on the trips going in and out the main slope of the mine. The main slope was the main tunnel, and it was controlled by an outside hoistman. This is a photo of the number 9 hoist. It was a 9-foot drum that wound the cable up that pulled the cars in and out of the mines. And this operator of the hoist knew what to do down inside the mine, because the rope rider would carry an instrument like this called a wrapper, and he'd reach up and have these rope rider wires running along the ceiling of the mine and short out and signal a bell to the hoist operator's room. There was something like a Morse code. So one short one was stop, 2 short ones was up, up slow was a short one, and a long one, and that let the hoist engineer know what was going down inside the mine. The rope rider didn't get a lunch break because he was going in and out of the mine constantly, so his lunch break was take his sandwich, stick it inside his bib overalls, take a couple of bites while you had a chance, stick it back inside your bib overalls, and move on.
So in the 1800s and early 1900s, this was high tech.
This was high tech. The mines were also very, very big on safety items, and we always had union miners here. This ribbon is from the Knights of Labor Union of 1888, when Washington was still a territory. That union preceded the United Mine Workers of America, which is the predominant mine union in the country now. In 1888, that union struck, and African American miners were brought in from Illinois on trains to break the strike, but they weren't told they were strike breakers until they got to Missoula, Montana in 1888. And at that point, what are you going to do? You might as well finish the ride. The Pinkerton Agency armed the strike breakers in Missoula, so when they brought the trains into Cle Elum and through Cle Elum, through Roslyn, and up to Ronald, where they unloaded the strike breakers, by then the strikers had heard about these men coming to break the strike, and so they met the train and they were armed. But when they opened the doors of the train, the strike breakers were armed, the strikers were armed, everybody had guns, so nobody shot anybody. And eventually worked into the community, and they were accepted in the community like the rest of the immigrants into the area. And some of the families stayed here for generations. In fact, the Craven family can trace its roots back to that first trainload of strike breakers when Mrs. Craven's mother was on, as a child, came to Roslyn in 1888.
Here, Nick, it looks like safety was also an issue that was practiced quite a bit.
Safety was very important in the mines. The Roslyn mine teams would be sent, as these banners attest, to Butte, Montana, Kansas City, Missouri, San Francisco, California, all over the states, and they would compete against other mine companies in drills for rescuing miners from cave-ins, rescuing miners, and demonstrating first aid. And it goes back as far as 1912, with this trophy was won in Helena, Montana at the Montana State Fair, and it was awarded to the Roslyn team September 28, 1912. James Bagley captain, James Pascoe, John Parker, Thomas Summerall, and Frank Good. And it was a very important, very prideful thing for Roslyn to maintain this. I refer to this as our Boston Garden Wall in the museum. And the large plaque is from the Washington State Department of Industrial Safety on Roslyn's award and safety merit for the mines. Every miner, besides being issued a small wallet-sized safety card, was also issued a diploma-type looking certificate to hang on the wall that showed they had passed their first aid training classes. And even in the mines, if you see this sign that says, "This way out, man way," those were posted in the mine so that if there was an accident in the mine and there was confusion because it was so dark in there, your light would find that and that would point you to the exit so that you wouldn't go deeper into the mine in confusion. The manway is referred to as the tunnel that the coal was actually dug into. And it's a little bit of a chauvinistic term, but in those days, women weren't allowed to work underground. It was against the law. But Roslyn had a lady, Gloria Tony Bailey, that worked in 1949 for 11 months in the mines, masquerading as a man to make money to open up a restaurant, and worked at the face of the coal. And she was caught. She kept her masquerade up even off duty by wearing men's clothing. And she was in a local tavern having a beer one night, went into the ladies' restroom dressed as a man. The night cop happened to be in there, so he went in to see why a man was going into the ladies' room, and she was caught and she left town the next day, supposedly to pick cherries in the Wenatchee area, but we've lost track of
No restaurant.
Gloria Bailey. And no restaurant, and never returned to town as far as we know. She was 18 when she did that. So she could still very much still be alive, and we would love to find her and bring her back and honor her. The museum and the Roslyn Ronald Cle Elum Heritage Club have agreed to honor her as Queen Coal at the Coal Miners Festival if we could locate her.
So again, what was her name, Nick?
Gloria Bailey. She went by Tony in the mines and worked as a miner right in the face of the coal, loading the cars just as well as any man would.
That would be a real find, folks.
This is a DuPont blasting machine detonator, which was used, probably most of us are more familiar with the coyote trying to blow up Roadrunner in the cartoons, and would run the plunger down, which ran a magneto and would set the charge through those two wingnut terminals and set the dynamite off. This is one of the early city bands from 1908. This gentleman here is from an old family, the Hawkins. This is Mr. Tom Hawkins. This is Mr. Tom Hawkins' tuba.
Nick, you talked about the strike breakers that were brought in and the fact that they continued to participate in the community and actually became part of the culture and part of the heritage.
Yes, and this is some of the more well-known African Americans of the community. Mrs. Craven, in that photograph, served as a Pioneer Days queen for our 4th of July celebration. Her husband, Sam, came in the 20s and was a coal miner and a grave digger. Mrs. Craven's son, William, was our mayor from 1975 to 1980. And when we elected Will as mayor, we didn't realize it, but we were electing the first black mayor in the state of Washington's history here in Roslyn. And Will's brother, Wes Craven, went on to be a heavyweight Golden Gloves champion in the Seattle area, representing Roslyn in that way. Will is still living here in town as well as Wesley and some of the other family members. Will is our vice president here at the Roslyn Museum, so he's still active in the community. The Roslyn community at one time had a 51% African American population. This pulpit that we're standing by came out of one of their churches in 1902 and was the original pulpit. And some of the families have collected some history, which we have in these books and old photographs. So we've got a pretty good history of the African American influence in Roslyn.
Certainly part of the community.
Definitely, very definitely part of the community. This article here that talks about Roslyn's first lady was Mrs. Strong, and her claim to fame was she was married to the cow marshal. Roslyn had a cow marshal. In the early days, when the Slavic people would have a dairy cow in their backyard to raise for their milk and butter, cheese, things like that, if your cow got loose and came uptown and got into somebody's yard or somebody's garden, Mr. Strong would catch the cow, take it to a corral behind the city hall, and it would cost you $1 to get your cow, which is in the 1930s, 20s and 30s, $1 was a lot of money to get your cow out of the corral. So we didn't have a dog catcher, we had a cow marshal.
Catcher. Nick, so here we are, more about the people. Doctors, lawyers, nurses, barbers, teachers.
Roslyn was a very diverse community, and in its heyday had between 4,000 and 5,000 people in it. So it had all the services of a city. It had doctor's offices, dentist's offices. This piece of oak furniture is actually an old doctor's examination table. Cle Elum was the location of the Roslyn Cle Elum Beneficial Company, which was the company that maintained the miners' hospital for the coal miners. This display case has some of the early day medical instruments and cases and some photographs of a couple of our early day doctors and early day lawyer. We have Dr. Lyons' bag in here, and Dr. Lyons' claim to fame was that the poor guy was murdered in Roslyn in 1896 and was so prominently thought of in the state that the governor even got involved in the murder case and offered a reward, and the murderers were never caught, and the murder to this day goes unsolved. We also have Dr. Heston's pill kit from the 1920s, early stethoscopes, and even a tooth puller from Dr. Sloan that was used in 1888.
Nick, more of everyday life in Roslyn, and as I look at these items, I'm compelled to think these look really old, but when they were being used, they were modern, high-tech, again, equipment, utensils, and the way of doing life.
It is. This area represents what would try to represent the kitchen area and things used in everyday life. This refrigerator, in fact, was the first refrigerator brought to Roslyn, first electric refrigerator brought. In 1923, it was owned by the local dentist, Dr. Lowe. And it's a General Electric, and to this day we keep some food in it just in case we get hungry here at the museum. We have some fresh chicken in case anyone is interested. The chicken might have to be boiled for a little bit before we can put it in the fry pan, but it's not too bad.
I'm not eating lunch here, Nick.
We also have items up on the wall that are early kitchen utensils, sieves and different ladles and hand mixers, things that people would use. And up on top of the kitchen queen or Hoosier cabinet, you'll notice that we have a bucket that says lard, which would probably make any cardiologist have his own heart attack. In the early days, before all the healthy oils that we cook with now, they just use plain lard. And the butcher shops who did their own butchering rendered their own lard. That bucket is actually from the public meat market that was owned by the Plesha family on First Street in Roslyn.
Looks like we have some certificates of honor here, Nick.
Yes, the mine was very proud of its certificate of honor, and these certificates are presented by the Joseph A. Holmes Safety Award, and these two certificates go to the Roslyn Clallam Coalfield Northwestern Improvement Company for mines 3, 5, 7, and 9, and they are in honor of having operated without a fatality from January 10, 1933 to January 1, 1935, producing 867,703 tons of coal in approximately 1,843,000 man-hours of work on an average day of 800 employees. So that is quite a record to have that much work done with that many men and go a couple of years without any fatal accidents. This large plaque on the wall was one of the safety awards won in Butte, Montana in 1928, and we have a photograph of the team that went back and won that with Claude Weber, Robert Bell Sr., Jack McSherry, Clarence Holmes, Thomas McCain, William Saul, and Herb Newman. About this team, Herb Newman was a mine foreman. He won the safety award. A few years later, he was killed in the mine from a blast. He had followed all the safety precautions, stepped around the corner from the blast, but a piece of rock had ricocheted inside the mine, somehow coming around the corner and hitting him in the head and killing him instantly inside the mine. So even when the rules were followed, there was danger in the mines.
So these people who lived in Roslyn and studied here, went to school here, went to church here, were doctors, lawyers. It was a great place to live, but it was also a dangerous place.
It was.
And our time machine takes on a little bit of a black part here because they were also killed here, weren't they?
Yes. This large photograph here is the power plant and the number 4 headworks. Number 4 was the only vertical shaft in the mine system here. Locally, we refer to it as the shaft. Very few people refer to it as number 4. The large building was a coal-fired generated electric generating plant for the electricity of the company. The smaller building back here was the hoist house that ran the headworks. This is the headworks that lowered the cage or the elevator up and down inside the mine. This mine unfortunately exploded on October 10th, 1909, killing 10 miners. The reason there were only 10 miners killed in that accident, it blew up on a Sunday and there was just a small crew working the tipple. If it would have blown up on a regular work day, there would have been 400 men inside that mine. The mine was never reopened. All the bodies were recovered. Some of them it took a couple of months to recover the bodies from the damage. And the mine was destroyed completely. In 1909 dollars, it was $50,000 damage to the mine and the structures, causing many fires around the town of Roslyn, from the flying timbers and the flying shingles from the roofs of the mine buildings that caught fire. The mine fire was eventually put out by the mine superintendent, thinking quick enough to reverse the fans in the mine and actually pull the air out of the mine and suffocate the fire from within, and that's what kept the fire from spreading any further through the system.
Earlier I was looking at some newspaper articles of that explosion. Could we go check those out again?
Yes we can.
Well, Nick, the explosion at number 4 mine was a disaster for this community, wasn't it?
Not only a disaster for the community in expected loss of income and commerce to the community, but in the loss of 10 well-known and well-respected miners that worked at the mine that day of the explosion. As you can see by the headline of the Cascade Miner, 10 lose lives in explosion. The disaster in mine number 4, the worst in many years. Wild scenes of anguish follow explosion.
Continues. Second explosion of coal dust sets everything ablaze instantly. Almost superhuman efforts of firemen and employees saved much property around shaft.
In those days, Roslyn, you have to remember, there were no fire trucks. Those were done by the hand carts that were pulled by the firemen to the scene. And they were a volunteer fire department that came and bravely fought the fires. And there were many fires started around town that had to be fought by the citizens in bucket brigades because the explosion had sent a wave of shingles flying all over the house and sparks landing on shingled roofs. It started many roof fires. And they were able to save that and avert even a larger disaster with the help of the citizens and the town pulling together.
As far as property was concerned, you mentioned earlier that there were a number of people killed and it could have been a lot worse.
If the mine would have blown up had the explosion on a regular work day, there would have been 400 men in the mine. As it was, exploding on a Sunday, there were only 10 men in the mine at the time, in the mine and on the tipple building outside the mine when the explosion happened.
As we're looking at the obituary page of our what date was it? October 9, 1909. There's a number of people listed here.
These are the miners that were in the explosion. There was Otis Newhouse. He was the outside foreman. William Arundel, James Grunnell, Aaron Isaacson, Daniel Hardy, Carl Berger, Johnny Jones, and J.F. Menendez was the superintendent of the mines. This gentleman here, he was not in the mine, but he was suffering from typhoid fever at the time, but was well enough to extinguish the mines by ordering the fans in the mines to be reversed and actually suffocating the fire from within the mine.
Still thinking.
By pulling the air out of the mines with the reversal of the fans.
Do you know any stories about any of these individuals?
Mr. Newhouse, that was the outside foreman, was on the tipple building, which is the building where the coal cars are sent and the coal is dumped after they come out of the mine. And the force of the blast blew him clear of the tipple building, badly burned, landing out in some weeds. And when his body was discovered by his children returning from church that day, when they saw the fire and the smoke, ran to see what was going on, knowing their father was there, and they found his body badly burned out in the weeds, and he perished later that night at the emergency hospital.
Major disaster.
A major disaster of unspeakable terms. In 1909 dollars, it was $50,000, 1909 dollars, damage to the structures and the mine itself.
So number 4 mine is located where?
In the south end of Roslyn, what we call Ducktown.
How about if we go take a trip to Ducktown in number 4?
We can do that. Let's take a walk down there.
Nick, you mentioned Ducktown. Just exactly where is Ducktown?
Ducktown is the south end of Roslyn, where the number 4 shaft is located. It's got its nickname from the Slavic people that lived there that raised chickens and ducks and let them run loose through the neighborhood.
Let's go to Ducktown.
Let's take a walk down to Ducktown.
So Nick, over there is Ducktown.
Yes.
And over here to our right is what is remaining of mine number 4, commonly known as the shaft.
Yes. This is the mine that exploded in October of 1909. The nickname the shaft comes from, this is the only vertical shaft in the Roslyn coal field. All the other mines went into the ground at an angle or slope, and they're called incline or slope mines. This is a vertical shaft of over 600 feet deep, and this is where the explosion started that ruined the shaft tipples and outbuildings and killed the 10 miners.
You said the explosion started. Did it go someplace?
Well, it exploded up out of the mine, and so it blew timbers up out of the mine like an explosion would blow things. Only instead of an explosion on the ground where it scatters, this blew vertical through the mine.
And then traveled down through the tipple building over in here.
And then the tipple building caught fire. The other outbuildings caught fire. It literally blew the headworks, which is the frame that lowers the elevator in and out of the mine, blew that completely apart. And some of the men that were working on the tipple were blown clear of the tipple and died later of their injuries, as we spoke of Daniel Hardy being one of those miners that his children had found him on their way home from church that Sunday morning.
Nick, the explosion was a pretty disastrous and traumatic thing for this community, yet there were some lighter things that you told us about.
There was one of the miracles of this explosion is that days later, as they were starting to recover the bodies and get down to see the damage that was done in the mine, they found a cat that was inside the mine that had somehow survived the explosion. And we have a picture of that cat at the Roslyn Museum on a postcard. I think we should name him Lucky. Somehow he survived, because this honeycombed out from this shaft with horizontal tunnels underground here, and he must have been back in one of those side tunnels somewhere.
In looking around, it's hard to believe that this was a major industrial area 100 years ago, that the ground was virtually covered with buildings and equipment and people working.
Yes, 100 years ago, this entire area was clear. You would see all the way through to the town of Roslyn. This is where the shaft, of course, was, the power plant that generated early electricity for the community. the Roslyn tipple, the Roslyn foundry was back here, mule barns, there was a sawmill. This was what today would be called an industrial park 100 years ago.
So our time machine is kind of moving us along then. One place that's very well known for maintaining a picture of time and history is the Roslyn Cemetery, which is actually famous around the state and around the country. Can we go take a look at that?
We can. That is the place where some of the miners are, and we'll look at some of the interesting epitaphs on the headstones.
Let's go look at some more history.
Okay.
Nick, the Roslyn Cemetery is known for being sectioned off and having specific people and cultures in specific areas. What area are we in here?
This is the old city section, the original public burial ground. The other burial grounds are reserved for groups of ethnic lodges and fraternal organizations.
So this would be probably where the oldest grave is as well. Do you know who that was?
The oldest grave was a young girl, 7 years old. It was Hannah Laffin, that was buried in 1887, a year after the town was founded. And this is the oldest and first section of the cemetery.
We've talked about Daniel Hardy quite a bit. Do you suppose we could find him?
I think we could. I think he's probably buried in the old city cemetery.
Let's see if we can find him. After you, sir. Well, Nick, here is Daniel and Ann Hardy.
Daniel was one of the miners killed in the mine explosion of the shaft, or number 4, where we were earlier today. And on the headstone, you'll notice that it says killed in explosion October 3, 1909. He was only 54 years old, and beneath this big pine tree is where him and his wife Ann rest for all eternity.
Well, Nick, our tour through time in Roslyn has certainly taken us through some interesting places, some interesting things, and some interesting lives of people. We've found that the people of Roslyn out here in the West had their own community. They were born, they went to school, they bought groceries, they saw theater, they were entertained, they played baseball, they worked, and in some cases were killed in rather dramatic fashion, as we saw at the mine explosion. And a community like many others in the great west of this country back at the turn of the century.
The early community members of Roslyn were typical of any early settlers and pioneers of the West. They came out and hacked the community out of the mountains of the Cascade Range and the forest and went underground to build a mine system that built our community, and were very strong, family-oriented, faith-oriented people that continue to this day making our community very strong.
Real individualists.
Very much individualists. And to see more of the individuals and more of the stories in Roslyn, I would invite the viewers to come by the Roslyn Museum.
There you go, folks. There's a great invitation. What's the address of the museum, Nick?
203 West Pennsylvania Avenue, downtown Roslyn.
Well, there it is then. Nick Henderson, the Roslyn Museum, and the people in Roslyn for the last 100 years. Nick, thanks for a great tour through time.
You're welcome.
This has been Art Colts, Around Town with Cable Channel 40. Local story, local people, local history. See you around town.